Hello. Today we'll be talking about the Jesse Wells song, The Olympics. This one is the shortest one I've done so far. It is very short, and it's kind of about the same topic all the way through. There's not a whole lot of different points I feel like you can make with this one. It kind of centralizes on a main idea. And that main idea is kind of the sense that baby boomers had unfair advantages over their children and their grandchildren, and now they have largely put the steps into place that have disenfranchised their children and their grandchildren. You know, the next generations have to suffer the consequences of either their actions or their kind of societal impact. And I think that one line specifically that I think is kind of an interesting one to talk about is the line, "I just woke up in the 90s, too bad I woke up poor." So I think that one's an interesting line specifically because I feel like it has two different kind of interpretations that I could think of. One is that back in from the 60s to 90s, kind of tapered off in the 90s. Different things costed extremely differently. The cost of living was much lower. You know, we all know about our parents or our grandparents that talk about you'd go to the store with pennies and you'd buy stuff. The amount of inflation that has occurred in the last 100 years is unlike anything like humanity has basically ever seen before. Of course, I'm sure there's instances where that's been different, and different countries will also be different, but just talking about the larger scale West society, because I know there's certain instances where different countries have faced worse inflation in the matter of 10 years, but speaking as a whole for the West, the amount of inflation is quite unprecedented from what typically there would not be such a huge difference that people would be able to live through. You know, a bottle of pop costing $5 now and costing 5 cents 50 years ago. It's not very comparable. And so things like that definitely, they added up extremely. And then, of course, the cost of housing was extremely lower. People were much more able to afford houses. A pretty normal job at like a factory and that sort of thing would be able to afford a mortgage. You know, you wouldn't be rich by any means, but you could afford a home. It was something that was realistic if you put the steps in place. Whereas nowadays, for the vast majority of people, it is completely an unrealistic goal. And so I think the line, "I just woke up in the 90s, too bad I woke up poor," could be seen as either people in the 90s that were still poor, there's always been the same problem of getting fewer opportunities, you know, from investments, from real estate, all these sorts of things. If you didn't have money to begin with, then you weren't going to buy those things. You weren't going to be able to. It's just kind of the availability that has changed. But I could also see that line not necessarily talking about the fact that there's always been people that couldn't afford these things and reap these rewards of different times. I could also see it as referencing Jesse Wells himself. He was born in the 90s, and so, you know, it's too bad he woke up, as in was born, poor in the 90s, not owning a whole lot to begin with. Because if you owned stuff in the 90s, you're pretty well set right now to live pretty comfortably. You know, if your parents owned a home in the 90s, then they're gonna sell it, buy another house that's more expensive, sell that for more than what they paid for, and so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons why real estate is so expensive, is no one's gonna sell a house for less than what they paid for it. That's just not the standard. You can argue that that's changing a little bit. I know that the real estate market, at least in the region I live in, is starting to go down a little bit, but honestly, it's not by anything that's dramatic. And so, you know, if you buy one house and you're set to live comfortably, basically, is the point. And so if you didn't have that when it was available, then you're fucked out of luck for now. And And then some more points I wanted to mention with this one is I just really love the line, the bank owns the car, we rent the house, but at least we paid for the street. Kind of criticizing overtaxation of different demographics, because we could argue till we're black and blue in the face. Lots of people will say that taxation is equally proportioned. It's not. It's absolutely not. People that do not make that much money have to give huge portions of their income to taxes. And yes, you may get that back. But like lots of people also don't. That's not an expectation that is exactly going to happen. For example, a personal anecdote is my parents owned a lawn care business, and we had to give around 50% of our income into taxes. And because of after, they would tax the exact revenue, not profit. And so we made very little in comparison to what our taxes were. And it ended up that we had to close the business because we couldn't afford the overhead of the business while also paying these taxes. And then the next job that my dad had gotten, he was guaranteed off of his wages $400 each month. That is outrageous when there's many, many rich people, like, speaking about billionaires, but also more, I suppose, realistic rich people as well, just like your average business owners in your hometown and all that sort of thing. They often have different tax breaks in how they do things. They'll donate a portion of their income to charities so they don't have to report that on their taxes, or they'll have it in special savings accounts that are non-taxed, and these sorts of things that enable the rich to stay rich while the poor do not have the excess funds to even be considered for those things. And so I think this song kind of, a lot of its point is things like that, is the fact that in previous decades people had much more upward mobility than they have now, whereas now it's always been the case, it's just more extreme. It is kind of the point, I feel, because lots of baby boomers or people that are doing well off themselves that are not in that category, that are like millennials and so on and so forth, will argue that these opportunities still exist, or that it wasn't actually as disproportionate. And you can look up any graph, any statistic out there, and you will find that simply just looking at minimum wage, for example, minimum wage was first made as something that people could afford the necessities. Now minimum wage doesn't pay rent. That should not be the case. It just shouldn't be. And so arguing that it's the same is just not practical. And I also think there's a huge kind of sense of entitlement with lots of people that are baby boomers, or kind of still reaped those rewards. These, like, lots of people in their 50s and stuff also had similar circumstances. And they tend to blame a lot of, like, 30 and 40-year-old adults right now, or teens into, honestly, just teens to 40s. They'll blame them for improper spending habits or being lazy and all that sort of thing for why they are not comfortable. And that simply is not realistic. They'll say you buy a coffee every day. If you didn't buy a coffee every day, you could afford a house. And it's like, that is just such an oversimplification of our modern world. It's just not how it works. And they simply don't understand that, because when they were buying their first houses, it was like that. You could afford a house if you just saved appropriately. And now saving appropriately, while being a good idea, because it's always good to have something extra, you're still probably not going to be able to afford that down deposit that you want. I know where I live, the minimum down deposit is $80,000. There's absolutely no way that 90% of people I know would ever be able to come close to that, let alone be able to give that over in one fell swoop. And I think that pretty well sums up a lot of my points I wanted to make with this. A lot of those are kind of my added points I feel that maybe this song doesn't necessarily say, but kind of hints at, because it is a very short song, but it is the general idea of what it's talking about. And yeah, so I'll see you later. Bye-bye.